the female brain, I suppose, for want of a better word, sort of a womb to tomb look like? How is our neurobiology shaped by our physical experiences of being a woman and being a woman in the world? What happens to our brains during puberty, during pregnancy, menopause, old age? Why are girls and women more vulnerable to anxiety and depression than boys and men? Boys and men experience that, but if you kind of had to take a look at numbers, there would be more girls and women in that sort of space.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to Something for Everybody. My name is Aaron Mashpitz. Dr. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I have a very important question to ask you before we really get into the meat and bones of it all, and that is, how are you doing? Like, actually, how are you doing, really?
That is like a really nice way to start a podcast. Actually, right now, I'm doing really well. I've had a good year. I'm also, I'm like an internal optimist and quite upbeat. My kind of baseline level mood is pretty high. And, right now, everything in my life is balanced and stable, and perhaps the only downside is we had to put the family dog to sleep about 6 weeks ago, and so I go through little phases of missing him, but we've got another puppy coming along in January to replace him. So if I had to think of one little kind of sort of speck on my overall upbeat positive vibe, it would just be missing my boy, missing my dog. But generally, life is good. I have a very wonderful, happy life, and I'm very, very fortunate. And I just like to sort of roll around in the good emotions when I've got them.
Yeah, I'm with that. Recently, I've been answering that question, never had it so good. And
Yeah.
it's sort of interesting, right? Because some people answer that question like, living the dream. And they're like, those people are not actually living the dream. I don't know if that's a phrase where you're from, but in America, people say that all the time.
I mean, like, whose dream, right? I don't know whether I ever dreamed. I don't think forward too much. I don't think I overthink too much. I just kind of get on with what I'm doing every day. But I would say right now I'm very content. And life is not always like that. There's these sayings as well. You're only as happy as your unhappiest child. And right now, my teenage sons, fingers crossed, are great. So yeah, I wouldn't say living the dream, but I'm pretty content. I wouldn't change much.
Yeah. You said you're having a good year. Do you define what that is at the beginning of the year? How do you feel or know that it's good, or what is that marker for you?
It's not anything I define in advance. I usually just sort of take what kind of comes my way. I suppose I'm thinking about the year looking back now, because in the last couple of days I've just wrapped up, a couple of really big projects that I've been working on. Pretty much my work year is done. And here in Australia, the school year, the work year goes like the calendar year, sort of January to December. And I happen to have wrapped everything up at the end of November. I've got a couple of days' work left to go, a conference to attend and speak at, a lecture to give tomorrow, and then I'm kind of done. And the 1st of December is the first day of summer in the Southern Hemisphere, or as we have it in Australia and New Zealand, first day of summer, we always think is the 1st of December. It's one of my boys' birthdays. It's kind of the start of party season. So I just feel like I'm right at that point where I'm looking back on a year of work and going, yeah, that was good. And now I can sort of dial down and get ready for the summer holidays and, all of the festivities of Christmas, New Year, etc.
Beautiful. I caught you at a great time then, it seems like,
You did.
Yeah.
You really did.
Tell me about the projects that you finished up, and then we'll get into some other stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So thanks for asking that. I teach I've got sort of 3 main online neuroscience programs that I teach, the professional development training programs and applied neuroscience. And the kind of, I suppose, the OG of them is the Neuroscience Academy, which is sort of an introduction to neuroscience, applied neuroscience and brain health. And I teach that as CPD or continuing professional development to like therapists. I've had doctors come through, social workers, lots and lots of coaches, whether they be leadership, life coaches, business coaches, allied health, anyone really who is interested in ongoing professional development within and sort of taking neuroscience into the work that they do. And I've been teaching that since 2015, and every 2 or 3 years I update all of the content. And I just went through the biggest update of the content that I've done since I launched the program in 2015. And it takes about 3 or 4 months to do that. So that's research, write the lectures, create the slides that can be engaging and interesting and taught online, writing the scripts, recording, updating all of the references and resources. So it's a really chunky project, and I finished that, and I'm super proud because I suppose it's the main kind of core of content that I teach my students, and I really want them to come away feeling that it's been useful. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't too light on. They've learned something. They've been able to use what I've taught them. And I've been teaching online for enough years now that I kind of know how to create an online learning experience for adults. I think I've got that part going quite well, but getting people to engage with the content as well is really important because neuroscience is pretty complicated. And I'm really, I'm just like thrilled that the big project is done of the update, and that I'm proud. I'm really proud of what I've done with that. So big tick for 2023. That'll keep everyone going for the next couple of years, that content. Well, hopefully.
Amazing. Well, congratulations on that. That's super cool.
Yeah. It's good. It's nice to have it done.
So yeah, I'll make a hard left here. In my great podcasting transition. To talk about something that is sort of very important to me, and I would imagine now very important to you since you're raising 2 teenage boys, not so young anymore. How are you thinking about masculinity, and how are you thinking about teaching them healthy masculinity?
Wow, gosh, that is a hard left turn. Having teenage sons is kind of wild. So one of them turns 14 in a couple of days. He's kind of he's young, 14. I've got a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old. The 15-year-old's 15 going on 20, and the 14-year-old's like 14 going on 12 or something. They're quite close in age, but seem developmentally quite far apart. And watching them grow up has been kind of wild. I am incredibly fortunate that I made a really damn good choice when I got married, and I'm married to a really gorgeous, an Irishman actually. We met when we were students, and we've had a really great marriage. We just had a 17th wedding anniversary a couple of weeks ago. And I think part of raising boys is raising boys in a family with my husband being who he is, and he's not the alpha. He's an economist, but he's smart and he's funny and he's warm and he's kind, and I'm so fortunate that I'm bringing boys up with him as an example of masculinity. I think where we live and the community, we live in Sydney, Australia. We live in the northern beaches of Sydney, and we don't have immediate family around us because I grew up in New Zealand and my husband's Irish. My dad lives in Australia, but he lives near Byron Bay. So we haven't got immediate family around. So we've really had to kind of lean into the community of people around us, where the boys went through primary school, sports communities, the high school they're in. And we've been incredibly fortunate as well that they've been exposed to, and they've kind of grown up with families with really good positive male role models as well. So that's something that we've really nurtured, and I'm really pleased with. And especially the high school they're in now. A lot of secondary school education in Australia is single sex, and they're in a co-ed high school. And it's unusual because the kids love that school. The kids, they love the school that they're in. And there's some really great young male role models there as well. My boys are into surfing, and a lot of the teachers are young males who surf, and they'll often see them at the weekend. So they're surrounded by a community of really good men too. So I think raising boys in that environment for me has been incredibly important. I grew up with sisters. My mum had sisters. I grew up with a lot of girls and women. I went to an all-girls Catholic school in New Zealand. So I didn't really grow up with males. I had lots of male friends, but I never really kind of had male puberty live streamed and didn't get to experience it in the same way I am now. And it's kind of wild. But I try very hard is take what I've learned, especially from thinking about the neuroscience of childhood development, adolescent development, the neurobiology of sex, the neurobiology of gender, having written books on these topics. I try and remind myself to take I sort of talk about it as like a David Attenborough approach, whereas I just kind of stand back and kind of watch a lot of what goes on, and try not to insert myself into their experience of adolescence, because it's a very different thing growing up and being a teenage boy. You would have more knowledge of that than what I have. And so far from what I'm observing, because it's not about me, their teenagehood, their wildhood, they're kind of leaving the family nest where mum's kind of at the centre. Well, I still try and keep the nest lined and warm and full of food. It needs a lot of food in it, the nest. Just sort of watching them kind of emerge out into that and kind of learn to be boys and men, or teenage boys in this world, is kind of fascinating. Luckily, so far, especially the older one who's kind of out and about more, hasn't made too many dumb decisions, which I think is a really good thing. You kind of feel like, a lot of the work that you did when they were young is paying off. Mostly I just try and stand back, and most of the behaviours that I'm observing, I try and remind myself these are completely developmentally normal. So there's one example I sometimes give of my oldest son. Catches the school bus from home, and as he's got older, and he's often not home. It's kind of like having a flatmate or a housemate. He's got a curfew of 10:30 at night, but a lot of the rest of the time he's kind of out and about with his mates. But I've said, no matter what, darling, does not matter when or for what reason, if you call me and you need me to pick you up in the car, I will. No questions asked. So what does he do? He's on the school bus on the way home. The bus stops probably less than a kilometre away from the house, and he rings me up in the bus and he's like, Mum, I'm so tired. Can you come and pick me up? And I'm like, well, I better go and pick him up, right? Because I promised. I said, no matter, no questions asked. So I go pick him up, bring him home. He disappears upstairs. He comes back downstairs, goes out into the garage, got a surfboard under his arm, gets on his bike. We live quite close to the beach. And he's like, oh, I'm going off for a surf with my mates. And I'm like, oh, you're not like really tired? And he's like, nah. And I said, do you want me to drive you to the beach? Because you're really tired. And he's like, no, I'm fine, Mum. And off he goes. And I think what neuroscience has taught me is how completely developmentally normal and healthy that response is, because what gives you energy is motivation, and what gives young people motivation is that kind of drive to belong and be a member of a tribe. He's not really thinking about mum driving him here, there or everywhere. He's really quite focused on coming home and then going back out for a surf with his mates, and that's developmentally normal and healthy. I'm like, great, that's what he should be doing. And instead of me kind of inserting myself into that and saying, well, it was very selfish of you before, and then you come home and you go straight out, I just kind of stand back and watch. And so long as he's safe and he's not making stupid decisions, because teenage boys can, so can teenage girls, I just kind of watch the things they do. And often actually I said to my youngest son yesterday when I can't remember what he was stomping around the house for early in the morning, and I said, gosh, your behaviour's so developmentally normal. They hate it when I say that. But for me, it's almost reassurance. The way that they are typically is completely healthy and as it should be. So I just try to provide the warm, nurturing nest for them to fall back into when they need that. Remind the younger one not to spend too much time on screens.
Mm.
We do quite a bit of sport together as a family. We sail, which sounds, very sort of privileged, sort of wealthy person sport, whatever. My husband grew up sailing in Ireland. Sydney, everyone, sailing's a big thing. And we often spend, all day Saturday down at, in the water. One of the kids will be sailing. The other one might be, the older one's a sailing coach. Me and my husband might be running the sailing races. And I think you're out in the water in Sydney Harbour in a boat, right? You've got a whole lot. That's pretty, you've got a lot of sort of freedom there. And I think kind of raising boys in an environment where they are doing that in a community
Mm-hmm.
is hopefully presenting the right kind of masculinity to them.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed a few really important points that I think a lot of our young boys here in America are missing. One being strong male role models to look up to.
Mm.
They're only finding that on social media. And now if you
Yeah.
get lucky, you can stumble upon a male role model on social media who's actually uplifting and talks about, kindness and respect and love and
Mm.
hope, also
Mm.
being
Mm.
tough and things like that. Or you can stumble on the other side of the coin. So we need a more emphasis on, yes, strong male role models. Young boys
Yeah.
don't really care what you have to say. They care what you do.
No.
They care
Yeah.
what you do. They
Yeah.
care what
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And that's very important. And then the community aspect. That's why sports in any frame
Yeah.
of sports, whatever that is super
Yeah.
important. And then,
So
like you mentioned, you doing with your boys is they have some freedom about them. But
yeah.
that's why sports are so good, right? Because sports have distinct rules, but
Yeah.
inside the rules, there's freedom.
Yeah.
So
Me
there's
and
constraints, and then there's freedom. Like, that's life.
yeah.
You're the
So
mom.
funny what
You
you
put the,
say.
go
Mine and
ahead.
my husband's parenting philosophy, or my husband called it this years ago. He calls it freedom in a framework. And we've always sort of thought, well, what's the kind of the framework, and it's kind of broadly geographical as well. Particularly, I keep looking out the window because we've grown up in this suburb and there's a lot of bushland around us, and um, they kind of grew up riding their mountain bikes in the bush and riding around the streets. And as they've got older, we'll be like, well, the boundaries of the suburb or where they could kind of go grew a bit. But within that, like if you're in the suburb and you're with these friends, like go for it. And they're in the bush building bike jumps and I don't know what else they're roaming around doing with sticks and rocks and things in the bush, which sounds kind of slightly wild. As they've got older, we've kind of, especially my older one, who's kind of a boy of a tribe and a bit of an adrenaline junkie. He's kind of got lately into spear fishing. I don't know whether they do that in the US, where you kind of dive under the water and spear fish with a,
Mm-hmm.
with a spear. With his mates, and then they take the fish home and they cook them up and they'll make like a fish curry or something, and it's quite primal. They can spend 3 or 4 hours surfing and then do some spearing, and there's their kind of day spent in the water. Now, as a mum, it's kind of hard to stay completely calm because they could stab each other, they could drown, or a shark could come. There's a lot of things that could go wrong, but we've given them a pretty loose, well, we've given them a framework, right? And there's a lot of freedom within that. And that, especially, I think, for teenage boys, the ability to kind of explore and hunting animals, I suppose, is so primal. And it just kind of feeds that need for them to do that. And so we've kind of allowed them to do that, even though sometimes I kind of have to breathe through the day. While they're out there doing it. I think it's just so important that they've got that physical freedom and the challenges to go and do those things. And hopefully then they make the choices to do that and not the other sort of dumb stuff that they could do for thrills.
Right. I mean, that's exactly why men's groups, where it's supposed to, better your emotional understanding and your mental health, are all like outdoors doing physical stuff. Then you
Yeah.
create these bonds with these other men, and then you're sitting at a fire and you're talking about how you haven't had intimacy with your wife for 3 years, and no, you haven't told anyone that, and you're like finally getting this thing off your chest because you did these physical acts with your friends. Now, I'm obviously not saying that's what your teenage sons are talking about, but he's still building, he's still building strong bonds. So maybe when something happens to him, he get, whatever it is, whatever teenage boys happen, like he has someone to go to outside of you. He's like, okay, buddy or mate, I've been dealing with this. Like, can we
Yeah.
talk about it while we're surfing or we're just riding the waves? Like, there's so much more that can happen outside of this physicality. That has to be, not has to be, usually that's the catalyst for men, because now we can use our bodies. We can feel like we're useful. That's really what we want to feel like, that we're useful.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah.
we have more of
Yeah.
ability to open up and share and talk about things and build
Yeah.
bonds, and like you're talking, how about the sense of belonging, which is so important,
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that idea of feeling useful. And I think that's the thing. If you feel like you've got, whether the right word is like kind of agency or autonomy or trust in your body because you've grown up learning how to use your body kind of in nature and in the outdoors. And, my boys were, you know, that's just how we brought them up from before they could walk, we were camping. So they've grown up in the outdoors, and I would trust them now more in I wouldn't go in the big surf, but they would if it was a big surf day. And I think giving them the opportunity to use their bodies and to build trust in their bodies, that their bodies are strong and capable, and to know the environment in which they live, and that they feel like they have not agency over the environment, but they've kind of grown their bodies up in this world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's that thing of, do they feel useful, or at least they feel confident in that space? And I think perhaps a lot of, and I don't know, I can't comment on other teenage boys apart from the ones that I know who've all kind of grown up the same way. Perhaps if you don't feel that same sort of physical strength, and like there's testosterone, like you can smell it in the air in our house, right? And I can see it and I can feel it, and I see them, like, the lights it'll be night and the lights will be on and they'll be flexing in the mirror, the mirror in the windows, walking around in just their board shorts, and they're flexing, and the older ones stopped doing this, but the younger ones started doing this. And both my boys kind of hit puberty early, but not sort of normal, but early-ish. So my 15-year-old's 6'4", my 13-year-old's over 6 foot. So they're kind of big, tall, strong boys, which I think is it's kind of helpful if you're a guy and you're like you hit puberty kind of on the early side and the late side, because you kind of rise up in social stature or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's definitely a protective mechanism in there. But I see the younger one, he kind of walks, because he's now taken over me, and I'm tall. I'm like 5'10", and he'll walk up and he'll like look down at me, and he's sort of strutting his stuff, and I can see that sort of biological urge to prove how big and strong they are, and they're so proud of that. So you've got to like give them an environment in which that they can use that new body and use that newfound strength. Because if they're not using their bodies, then they're sort of stuck in their heads, and that's a really dangerous place to be.
Yeah, I can picture the exact moment in my life where that all like sort of meshed for me, when I saw physical changes in my body. The physical changes in my body made me feel more confident. I all of a sudden got good at the sport I was playing, and it just sort of skyrockets.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
cool. So that's really
And
awesome.
giving a positive feedback loop to that, as like a masculinity being modeled by good men,
Mm-hmm.
I think is so important for them, because I could so easily see how that you can just see this kind of I don't know, animalistic kind of in them. Girls don't have that. I didn't have that. I never experienced that, but I can see it. I can feel it. I'm their mother. I can feel it in my body coming from them. If that's not given the right place to be expressed, I could see how easily it would just go. They could head down the wrong path so easily. I feel it in my body, and I think that's a real mother kind of sense. You just know the second you see them, you know what they think and feel. So, but you've got to kind of put the groundwork in as well. Like we've been putting the groundwork in for a lot of years, me and my husband. And like so much of the credit of this has to go to my husband. He's a good man.
Yeah, well, cheers to him and cheers to you guys. So my parents did the same, and my mom was is currently still a rock star. So cheers to
Cool.
her
I
too.
can't wait until the boys say that about me. At the
Yeah.
moment, I'm still kind of cringe, but that's normal. That's
Mhm.
cool. I'm happy to wait.
Oh, they will, and then they'll express their love for you more than they can imagine. Because then us boys feel that for our mom. We're like, wow, she
Yeah.
did so much for me. I love her.
Yeah. Oh,
So
that's so
it's
nice to
crazy.
hear. That's
But
so nice.
speaking of testosterone and hormones,
Yeah.
you do a lot of work with that, and you've researched a lot of that. Why should we care about hormones? Why is that important?
I think we should care about hormones, but sometimes I feel like we care a little too much about
Mm.
hormones as well. So when I went into writing my first book, it's the women's, you can see the girls back there, the Women's Brain book. It's got different titles in different parts of the world. I wanted to take a look at sort of, the female brain, I suppose, for want of a better word, sort of a womb to tomb look. Like how is our neurobiology shaped by our physical experiences of being a woman and being a woman in the world? What happens to our brains during puberty, during pregnancy, menopause, old age? Why are girls and women more vulnerable to anxiety and depression than boys and men? Boys and men experience that, but if you kind of had to take a look at numbers, there would be more girls and women in that sort of space. Why are women more vulnerable to Alzheimer's disease later in age? And so I wanted to kind of explore a lot of these questions about, I suppose, female life transitions through the lens of neurobiology. And I went into this as a neuroscientist, but not with a very firm understanding of neuroendocrinology, so kind of the neuroscience of our hormones. And I very much went into the book thinking, well, I'm going to learn a whole lot about hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone, sort of female sex hormones released from the ovaries. But what was really interesting was at every stage, whether I looked at puberty, whether I looked at pregnancy, whether I looked at menopause or other experiences, hormones were only kind of like one voice in the crowd in terms of determining an outcome or an experience. So puberty, we've just been talking about kind of like male female puberty, and this idea, well, obviously the testosterone in the boys turns them into men, and estrogen, in the girl, it's like when your gonads kind of turn on with puberty. Then that kind of starts to shape and sculpt your body, but your brain also goes through puberty too. And I kind of thought, well, as it the hormones of puberty that will make girls more vulnerable to depression as teenagers than boys. Not to say boys are not, but on average, girls are more vulnerable. But what was interesting was when I looked, there was this one particular longitudinal study done here in Australia looking at the development of sort of social emotional problems around puberty. And if you looked at girls who entered puberty much earlier than their friendship group, they were far more vulnerable to develop social and emotional problems or mood disorders versus girls who went through puberty at the same age as their peer group. And boys were kind of, slightly early. Boys who went through puberty slightly earlier than their friendship group were sort of slightly protected versus those, there's always that little guy in everyone's class and he's 16 and he still hasn't grown. Those boys are far more vulnerable. And so you've kind of got pubertal hormones kicking off in these kids at these different ages, but the stronger determinants of, their social and emotional outcomes was the kind of the context those kids were in. Hey, my body's changing. What's happening with my friends' bodies, my friends' perceptions of me, my perceptions of them. Context was a stronger determinant of an outcome than simply a hormone. So it's always kind of like hormones are important, but in context. We see the same if we think about PMS in women as another kind of went into looking at that in my book, thinking, well, I'm really interested in the role of female hormones and mood. I personally have always been pretty mood stable. I've never really kind of shown any monthly fluctuations, and I've always been pretty stable. So I did kind of go in going, well, how many women suffer from PMS? This must be a thing, right? And I started looking at all of these studies, and I came across a global meta-analysis looking at rates of PMS around the world. So women putting their hands up and saying, yep, I suffer from PMS. And it varied like dramatically by country. Some countries, around 10% of women were saying, yeah, I have PMS. So say France, Spain, it was around 20 to 30%. You would go into Middle Eastern countries, it could get up to as high as 90%. So that's kind of wild, like 10% to 90%, with lots of different countries in between. And I was like, well, if this is a hormonal thing, why is it varying so much depending on social cultural context? And we see that a lot. We see hormones are kind of one voice in a crowd, but often what shapes an experience is not just the hormone, it's the content, the context a person is experiencing. This perhaps hormonal shift or neurological shift or life transition in.
So it has a lot to
they're
do with
useful and important, but I think we can focus on them so much we forget about the other kind of, taking a biopsychosocial approach. Stick the brain in the middle, you've got the biological influences of your body. You've got the social, cultural, the world kind of making its way into your senses. You've got streams of information coming in. And now with my phone with me, you've got thank goodness I haven't got my phone with me. You've got the every calamity and war and disaster and opinion of every single human on the planet, like streaming in. It's like right in front of your face. Wars used to be on the other side of the world. Now we're expected to be live streaming them and having a firmed opinion on them. And then we've got, our psychology, this kind of top-down expectations, memories, experiences, meaning making. And I think when we think, well, hormones are important, we're forgetting about all of the other data that's coming into our brain that we're making meaning of. And that's what my research in my book showed me. Hormones, they play a role, but they're not the loudest voice in the crowd all the time.
Yeah. And I think they can't be like this handicap for the reason, like maybe why, like my hormones are this, so this is why I'm this way, instead of
we default,
looking at
we blame them.
Yeah. I
We
mean,
see that particularly girls and women almost have been sort of fed this story. And I haven't got daughters, so you can be sure I would have not been saying this if I did. If you've got a female body and brain and you add female hormones in, it doesn't matter whether it's puberty and they're kind of kicking off, your menstrual cycle where they're fluctuating every month, you're on the pill, they're kind of high but stable. Through pregnancy, they're sky high. Menopause, they sort of start to fluctuate again and then kind of whittle away. It doesn't really kind of matter whether they're going up or down, they're high or low. We're blaming them when things go wrong. And it's almost as if we've been taught that the combination of a female body and brain and hormones automatically equals emotional instability and cognitive dysfunction and decline. It is inevitable. And that's simply not the case. Thank goodness that's not what neuroscience is showing us. I tried to unpack these ideas in my second book on baby brain.
right.
There's the context and the expectations and the meaning we're making of all of these hormones. Yeah, they're playing a role. But the kind of the volume will be different in every person. And then almost the meaning that you're making of that signal is going to be different in every person too. And we just have this tendency, especially for women, you never hear men, the men love their tea, right? You love a bit of testosterone and you worry if it drops, whereas women are kind of taught that that'd be blamed when things go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, I mean, at least I can relate it to nowadays. If masculinity is always toxic, then I might as well just not try. I might not do anything, and I won't try to be my best, and I'll just that's my blame. And then the same on the women's side. If I'm always emotionally unstable as a woman, I might not even trying to do anything else, when obviously that's not true. I
Mm,
have
yeah,
emotionally stable women in my life. I've met them all the time. We all have emotions
yeah,
that fluctuate and things that bother us. But if that's my handicap, if that's what I always fall to, then I don't have any agency or response to direct it
yeah,
in any sort of other way. I'm just you know, I'm throwing bricks on myself and I'm wondering why I can't stand up.
yeah. Oh gosh, you're speaking my language. Yeah, absolutely. We just take this deficit. I think testosterone in men has a different kind of cultural narrative at the moment than hormones do in women. But in women, they're often associated with deficits, not strengths. And my second book, Baby Brain, really was talking about, well, hey, the hormones are driving a large degree of the neural architecture changes that are taking place during pregnancy, and their evolutionary adaptive changes to enable the kind of the brain to become a maternal brain, to sort of read babies' social cues once they're born and to kind of almost focus on the baby, forgetting about everything else. And that's an adaptive benefit. It might not feel like it because babies are hard work, right? Like they cry, but you just kind of can't keep your hands off them either. You just kind of want to eat them all up. They're so gorgeous. Um, and I spend a lot of time trying to explain that these are positive, beneficial changes that were driven by pregnancy hormones. But yeah, we focus on the deficits in female hormone narratives, not the strengths. And now we've kind of got, there's a whole new kind of story emerging around menopause and hormone therapy, which is kind of weird because we've got this really negative narrative around the oral contraceptive pill, and they're both like hormones that you're supplementing, right? Like
Mm.
actually take the same medication for both. So, we're making a lot of meaning there that's not necessarily evidence-based, but that's just my little pet peeve.
Yeah. When I was thinking about baby brain, like
Mm,
I I I just couldn't understand why we would assume that mothers would get like basically stupider during pregnancy. Like I don't understand that, because all the mothers that I know who have babies are exceptional human beings. So
mm.
why would evolution or mother nature herself be like, yeah, you'll get dumber even though you have to care for someone that is like literally can't do anything themselves.
Yeah. Well, that's not what Mother Nature has done. I think what I've come to understand writing the book, taking and I dived down deep into the cognitive testing that's been done on women who say, oh, hey, I've got baby brain, whether that be during pregnancy, at different stages of pregnancy and early motherhood. And sort of in some, around 4 out of 5 women will say, hey, I have baby brain. Again, I was the one of, I seem like kind of impervious, right? Um, I, I didn't experience it, but I didn't know it was a thing either. And I think
Mm.
that was kind of for me quite telling. I didn't know I was meant to experience baby brain, and I didn't experience baby brain. And I specifically know I did not, because I moved out of academia into working sort of in industry and science and health communications when I was around 7 or 8 weeks pregnant with my oldest son. So I clearly remember taking a huge career shift at that time, and really loving the challenge. I thrived, despite growing a child inside me. So the thing is, if we bring bring all women into the research lab and say, hey, let's do cognitive testing on you, we're just not picking up cognitive decline, which isn't a really good thing. So I say this to women, they go, well, that's not what I experienced. And said, it's a good thing we're not detecting cognitive decline, because that's what we detect in people who are starting to show the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. We do not want cognitive decline. So what's going on? We do see in some women in the third trimester of pregnancy, like maybe they might score a point less
Mm.
on average than a standard kind of test of cognition, but only in some women, sometimes in the third trimester. Not every study, many studies pick up nothing. And some studies have actually found enhanced cognition in that third trimester of pregnancy. In new mothers, we're not picking anything up. So there's quite a kind of a paradox between the objective experience or the objective measures in the research lab and then the subjective experiences of women. And I'm not here to say it's all in your head. However, there has to be some reason for that paradox. And the researchers have gone in and interrogated that. I've picked up on kind of a few signals there. One is that we think overall well-being, like, are you feeling socially supported? Are you feeling very, very stressed? Are you feeling well, health-wise? How's your sleep? Like, overall well-being is very closely related to rating baby brain as being good or bad. So women with low well-being, overall things aren't, they're really struggling with pregnancy or early motherhood, are much more likely to report that they have baby brain, even if we say, hey, here are your cognitive tests. So that's really interesting. And so what we think is perhaps going on is women are using this word baby brain. For some reason, they've picked it up from kind of the world around them. They've picked it up as a way of describing the experience of just generally not kind of coping, because it's really hard work becoming a new mum, particularly for the first time, because you're having to, it's an enormously steep learning curve. Even if your brain has been kind of rewired by pregnancy to be primed to look after your baby, you've still got to learn. We just hope the learning curve isn't quite so steep because of the neural changes that have taken place. But most of your attention is taken up with thinking about that baby, not thinking about all of the other things you used to do. And so memory depends on attention. And so if you're forgetting things, it's not because of a cognitive neurological deficit. It's just because you can't pay attention to everything, and you shouldn't have to be paying attention to everything. In fact, other people should be picking up that slack for you and helping you out. So it's almost as if baby brain is a word women are using to describe that just kind of experience of just simply not being able to do it all. But they've internalized it to blame their brains. Well, it's my neurology, so poor old me, dumb old mum. Instead of it just being because it's got the word brain in it, it's a description of an experience, but it doesn't mean it is a neurological deficit.
How do we how do new mothers get the support they need so they don't feel like this? I mean, I know it's not 100% possible because they're just like, it's really hard regardless if you have support or not. But I mean, what's the advice there?
Well, I don't think new mothers should be the ones having to get the support themselves. They've got enough on their plate. It's, when Mother Nature didn't intend us to parent alone. We are human mammals and we're alloparents, which means we share parenting care. Of course, mothers, traditionally or, biologically are responsible for nourishing the baby, but they don't have to. There is, you can use formula. I fed my boys, but I was lucky they were great feeders and it was easy for me. But I think it really comes down to that sort of that social support, that structure that should be around women. And it's easy for me here in Australia talking to someone in the US because we have, parental really, great. They probably could be more generous, but pretty generous maternity leave, parental leave. It doesn't have to be the mother. We've got great parental leave policies. That's kind of part of life here. We have community health nurses that kind of come in, every new mum into the community. They'll come into your house and sort of meet you and establish you within like kind of a little social network of other mums in the area of the same age, or other parents in the area of the same age. We've got, the government here in Australia as well as talking about subsidising even more and more and more childcare for particularly low-income families, to kind of help support those people. But I also think mothers need to be supported if they want to stay at home too. There's still a bit of a social sort of stigma around that, I suppose. So it's really, I suppose, a social and then kind of a society and then a political problem to solve as well. It shouldn't be up to each new mum to be crying out for help.
Right.
You'd hope that those systems would be in place. Of course, that's not the case for every woman who has a baby. But yeah, it shouldn't be up to the new mum to figure that out. You'd hope that a lot of that infrastructure would be supplied to her without her having to be the one that reaches out.
Yeah. And if it's not, that's where sort of this super mom term, comes in, sort of
Mm.
the opposite of baby brain, where they feel like they
Mm.
have to, no matter what, do everything all of the time.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
even
yeah.
though you can't multitask, it's not real. Mothers almost get it done. So that's also an
Yeah.
interesting thing as well.
And that's just draining, and that leads to burnout. Burnout's almost inevitable when you're a new parent or a new mum without good, strong social support. I mean, we weren't meant to be parenting the way that we do. I mean, I probably shouldn't have been parenting the way I was. We didn't have immediate family around us when my boys were little. Luckily, I chose not to go back to work. We were in the financial position where I was fortunate enough not to have to go back to the workplace. I kind of built, my business up on the side as the boys got older. I had a really good, strong community around me, but I purposefully went out and, you know, created that. But it wasn't easy at all. It would have been a whole lot easier with aunts and grandmothers and grandparents around for support. So sometimes I was hanging in by my fingernails. But yeah, and luckily my boys were easy. They were straightforward. They were healthy. They fed. They slept. But the shift in your perception of who you are as a parent is, gosh, that was kind of wild as well.
Did you experience any like serious low points during your early motherhood days?
I never had depression at all, and I didn't really have anxiety. I had anger, which is a
Mm,
really confusing emotion to feel, and part of that is biological, particularly. I mean, the mama bear response, lactational aggression, it's called when you are a breastfeeding mammal. Um, your hormones almost kind of make you aggressive to protect your young. Now, whether that was underlying that emotion that I had, or whether that was perhaps kind of a sort of a baseline emotion simmering away, perhaps primed by hormones, and then added on top of that the frustration and the confusion of figuring out who I was as a new mum, the overriding emotion I felt at times was kind of around anger and frustration, and never sadness, never despair, never fear, worry, anxiety. It was anger, and that is a really confusing emotion to navigate, because mums shouldn't be angry. We're meant to be placid and warm and kind and loving no matter what. And so there's quite a lot of shame that comes with that, and it's only
mm.
been as years on you talk about that emotion with other women, and I think, gosh, even in the 15 years since I've been a mother, the conversations have become far more open. um, we're talking about anger in early motherhood is far more acceptable, but it's a shame-filled emotion, because you should never feel that way. And it took me time to navigate that, and I saw a therapist. I went and saw
Mm.
my GP. I said, something's going on. She says, well, you're not depressed. I can guarantee you that you're good, but you go and speak to someone. And I went and saw a psychotherapist who essentially helped me unpack just we use this word matrescence now, which, God, I wish I had known that word back then. This kind of journey through motherhood, it's like adolescence, but it helps describe the physical, the social, the spiritual, the psychological, the sort of the change in self that you experience as you become a mother. It is a process of becoming. And she helped me unpack that. And by unpacking that, it kind of helped me dial down that feeling of shame around the anger, and just gave me some tools and things to cope. And I always remember, and I think about this so often, she was an Eastern European lady. I'm not going to do her accent, but she just kind of sounded like a psychotherapist. You kind of have that kind of accent in your mind. And then she said, every crumb you wipe from, and she used to talk with her hands. She said, every crumb you wipe from the bench and every little sock you pick up from the floor and roll up. She said, just keep in mind that you are building men. You are building good boys who are going to grow into good men. And I was so busy going, oh, I have to pick up another sock, I have to wipe up another crumb. I was so caught in this quagmire of self-flagellation that I couldn't stand back and see. But she could see, she had perspective. She could see, and she'd just say these things to me. And I've always remembered her saying that, and I can hear her voice in my head. I'm thinking, oh, wow, like I still pick up the stupid socks. But I can see the bigger picture now. You can't see the big picture early on, but I can look back and I can think, God, I did kind of grow them up. And that was so important to me, was just having that person to just explore that with. I don't think you can do that alone. You'd have to be very self-aware to be able to unpick that process if you're finding it difficult without, another person like a therapist.
Yeah, you need someone to help you recognize your blind spots and then, help you pull yourself out of the trenches so you can see a brighter, broader view of what's happening.
Yeah. You just, yeah. And
Do you
now I think, and then suddenly in the blink of an eye, here I am.
mhm.
I mean, I've still got a long way to go. They're not done yet. They're still, young middle teens.
Yeah,
Still got a few years of high school left to navigate.
but it's going well, and it seems like a fun journey.
Not wood, touch wood.
Yeah. But do you think our society today overvalues or undervalues mothers, or somewhere in the middle?
I mean, oh gosh. I personally have never felt undervalued, but like I say, I feel like I am often quite impervious. I'm quite, especially, and even then when I was struggling with this matrescence journey, I never felt undervalued. I've never really cared what society in general thinks about me. That's not my lens on the world. So it's kind of hard for me to say. And then having been immersed in motherhood and parenthood in a community where, we've kind of had fun along the way, raising our kids together in this great neighborhood I live in, I've never felt undervalued or devalued within my community. And what sort of out there reflects back on me, I don't really think too hard about. I don't take on board that. Here in Australia, as when my kids were born, we were given this so-called baby bonus. You were given 5,000 Aussie dollars for every baby you had. So they kind of paid you for having that I suppose didn't really, financially impact me and my husband that much. It's an enormous amount of money to many people. So I guess in terms of a government policy, country that I've brought my kids up in, Australia's always made me feel very valued as a mum.
Mm.
But like there's always a few kind of things that could be done or enhanced or done better. And I suppose also because I have run my own business, and so I haven't had to deal with corporates or gatekeepers or expectations. And every country in the world is going to be very different. I'm very aware the US is very different in terms of how women may experience motherhood compared to how I've experienced motherhood. I personally never felt devalued, but I don't take my values from those signals.
Mm. Yeah, that last part's very
I'm
important.
probably not the best person to ask that question to.
Why not?
I don't know. Well, I mean, it's because for me it's personal, and I haven't felt devalued or overvalued. And also, I decided a long time ago that also because I was running business from home, my husband, he's more hybrid now, as most of the world is, that I was not going to raise boys where mum was not valued as a equal member of the family. Like I didn't want to be the cook, cleaner, driver, even though I largely am. My husband does it quite a lot, especially as the boys have got older. I'm kind of been pushed aside. He sometimes doesn't think I do a good enough job. In a joking way, he's very lovely. But I decided a long time ago that I was not gonna. If I did 3 nights a week of dinner, and he did 3 nights a week organising, that showed my boys that he valued me as much as I valued him. We value each other as parents and as family members. And so I've got agency over that and those decisions. And so that's perhaps where I've got the value signals from.
Yeah. Yeah. And intrinsic value, feeling like you're worthy and you're enough based on the people you're around, how you feel about yourself. And
Yeah,
then,
absolutely. Yeah.
and then you also happen to be a mother too, which is another gift on top of that.
Yeah. And I gained so much value outside of motherhood with my, my career and my interests. I can kind of fill myself up with all of that as well.
Yeah. The last little thing that I want to touch on that I found very interesting looking at all of your stuff was that you talked about fathers have a decrease in testosterone if they're more if they care more for the child. Can you just touch on that quickly?
Yeah. I love that result. Some men get really freaked out by this. I set off a bit of a furore here in the Australian media. We've got quite a shock jock radio host here in Australia. I spoke to him about this, and then he had talkback radio talking about men being what's the word?
Emasculated.
Emasculated by parenthood. And then it kind of moved over onto TV a couple of days later. So they got a male doctor in to talk about all of this, talk about my book. Be funny. And see, I could feel devalued then. I don't. I just roll my eyes and go, oh God, the men, they're so predictable. Maybe many female authors might feel devalued that their book, the topic in their book was turned into a talkback radio conversation with men calling in the male DJ, and then the male radio TV hosts then got the male doctor in. That doesn't make me feel devalued. That just makes me roll my eyes at the predictability of some men in the media. It's funny, people said, how did you feel about that? And I said, oh God, just ridiculous. I don't know where I get this. I think I just had a great parents who just instilled some kind of, I don't know, resilience in me or something. So the story is, I've kind of told the side story. The story is, and this has come out of a number of different studies. In fact, interestingly, a very large longitudinal study of men's health in the Philippines. We don't often see, research emerging, and I think it's really great when we see, different, research coming from countries we don't necessarily expect. So it's looking at the levels of testosterone in men at different points in their life, and found that testosterone levels drop quite dramatically in men as they engage in caregiving, when a new baby kind of comes into the family, or whether they're involved with caregiving. And that relationship is very much dose dependent. So the more engaged they are with the caregiving, the more their testosterone drops. And some men find that very confronting, because I guess the narrative is you don't want your T down, you want high T, because that's kind of where your health and masculinity comes from. And this was interesting, because I suppose the story always was that if you're engaged in caregiving, your oxytocin levels will be really, really high. We don't really see oxytocin levels change that much. It's more the ratio between the oxytocin and the testosterone which appears to change. And so when you've kind of got high oxytocin and high testosterone levels, you're kind of more in, let's just say, a dating, mating type, behavior sort of place. And it's hard to, and it's probably the behavior reinforcing the hormones. There'll be a positive feedback loop there. But when you're caregiving, your testosterone levels go down, your estrogen stays high, so you're much more in a kind of a nurturing parenting kind of place. And those men who are less engaged with fathering, their testosterone levels kind of tend to stay high. And then this is perhaps what's slightly uncomfortable, is that some studies have looked at those men who remain the high T father. Their relationships with their partners are perhaps slightly rockier, for want of better language, and the women will often report, that they feel they're finding parenting a bit more difficult. I'm being quite euphemistic here, and this is not every man and every family. This is just kind of the broad pattern. And so I think if I kind of think about, well, what's the kind of evolutionary adaptation going on here, or what's Mother Nature like kind of trying to do here? I suppose the intention is humans are allo parents. We're meant to kind of not be parenting. Mum isn't meant to be parenting alone. So if you've got a father who's engaged in parenting and he's got low testosterone, he's probably less likely to want to go out and mate and date somewhere else. He's much more kind of likely to stay, kind of in the nest and help raise those kids. And that's kind of a nice thing. Perhaps the downside for the individual there, not looking at that family unit, but the individual male there, is there are correlations between drops in testosterone and mood disorders and depression in some men. Just in the same way that in some women, when there's fluctuations in hormones, that can make them more vulnerable to depression. But that's not every woman all of the time, and it's not every man all of the time either. Just in some men, they may be more susceptible when their testosterone drops. But then if you look at the overall family unit, that family unit is a healthier, happier family unit with the low T. So that's kind of the pattern. And it was that story that I suppose upset some of the talkback callers,
Yeah.
You can imagine how that kicked off.
I mean, it makes sense to me. Like I think we should be nurturing and caring and compassionate fathers, and we can get our testosterone out by still going to the gym. So our mood is still stable and moving our body, but we're present. We're present fathers because that's our duty. If we're going to have a baby and we're going to make a woman pregnant, right? Our duty is to be present, caring fathers. And if low T is what Mother Nature needs for us, then that's what we do. So that's I mean, don't argue with it. It's biology. It's the neuroscience. It's real.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing is, some fathers are present for conception only and never seen again, and some fathers can be the primary caregiver. So there's this enormous variation. I mean, if a mother's experienced the pregnancy, she's there. She may not necessarily, usually is the primary caregiver, but not always. But men's experiences vary enormously. And I think, like, to kind of go back to the beginning of this conversation, you said, well, why should we care about hormones? Why are they important? Well, they're interesting and they're important, but they're not the only thing that matters. And they're just part of like a context, a social situation. And sometimes it's really hard because there's always feedback loops between behaviors and biochemistry. And sometimes it's hard to separate them. They're always kind of reinforcing or not each other. That's kind of how loops work in biology. So if we only focus in on kind of these one data points and in terms of a biological input to a brain, we forget about all of the other stuff that's coming in.
Yeah. We sometimes forget that we can take responsibility and ownership over our lives, and then
absolutely,
and then respond to the things that happen to us instead of trying to be ultra reactive all the time. Yeah. But thank you, Dr. Sarah. I appreciate your time.
Oh, look, it's been such a great conversation, and I appreciate your questions. You've kind of pulled a lot out of me that I wasn't expecting to share, but it's, I hope that everyone listening has found it useful and helpful.
Absolutely. I sure did. Where should people go if they want to know more about you, learn more, see more?
Yeah, so the best place is my website. That's kind of a portal into, everything else, courses and the books and social media, etc. So you would pronounce it in the US, Dr. Sarah McKay. So it's DrSarahMcKay.com. I pronounce it Mackay because it's the traditional Scottish way, but DrSarahMcKay.com, and you can go and follow whatever little digital path you want to go down from there.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate it.
No, you're so welcome.
If you enjoyed that episode, please click here for another full-length episode of the podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe. But above all else, most important, please take good care of yourselves and others. And I'll see you next time. Lots of love. Cheers.